grand finale. Thank you to those who've been here before. If you're new tonight, you may have to hang on for dear life because this presumes the first read. So I'm going to ask you all to please stand for our opening prayer. And you know this melody, so don't. God, beyond our dreams, you have stirred in us a memory. You have placed your powerful spirit in the hearts of humankind. All around us we have known you. All creation lives to hold you. In our living and our dying, we are bringing you to birth. God, beyond all names, you have made us in your image. We are like you, we reflect you. We are woman, we are man. All around us we have known you. All creation lives to hold you. In our living and our dying, we are bringing you to birth. Please be seated.
A reading from the book of Psalms. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and night wraps itself around me, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God! How vast is the sum of them! I try to count them. They are more than the sand. I come to the end. I am still with you. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Let us pray. O God, indeed, where can we run from your love? You are with us always and everywhere. And yet even so, sometimes we are not attentive and do not recognize your presence and love for us. We ask you tonight to open our hearts and minds that we might become more attentive and more open and more responsive. We ask this in the name of Jesus the Christ. Amen. So here's what I'm hoping we can do tonight. We're going to start with a small group discussion as we did last week, and I'm going to ask you at table to share what you did for your homework, and I'll review those questions in a bit. Then we're going to try something we haven't done before during this series. After you've all spoken at your tables, I'm going to ask maybe for some large group feedback, what's some of the consensus or some of the wisdom that emerged from your conversations. Then I'm going to do present some material that I think hopefully will summarize and synthesize all of those conversations, maybe give you some language and different language to group all that together. I'm going to share with you what the philosopher Paul Ricoeur calls a root metaphor that hopefully will tie a nice image that ties everything together. Then we're going to look at some predicaments, and you'll see why we're looking at predicaments by the time we get there. Another small group discussion, and then an evaluation of the program on paper, anonymously if you prefer, and then a closing prayer. So that's a pretty packed agenda for tonight. Are you game? All right, so let's look at the questions that I asked you to consider for your homework. The first one, try to identify an experience or situation in which you were convinced God was present, active, involved. Perhaps the time when you felt you were caught up in something bigger. What was it about that experience or situation that convinced you? And what signs or symbols, official or unofficial, help to interpret or understand that experience or situation? All right? So take a minute to recollect your thoughts, and then when you're ready, just begin to share. As I was standing here listening to you speak, I remembered an experience that I had. Some of you know this, and I can never remember where I share these stories. So when I was about 6 months from being ordained a deacon at St. Mary's Seminary, I realized that I was a very good seminarian and a very good student, but I wasn't sure that that was going to translate into being a good priest. So I had an attack of cold feet, serious attack of cold feet. I'm not sure I should go through with this. And every Thursday morning at the seminary, we used to have Eucharistic Holy Hour. I frankly called them solemn Eucharistic naps because I often fell asleep. And I was in the music department, and in this particular Holy Hour, I was in the choir by myself, and the priest, Father John Vrana, who's a spiritual director at the time, he read a letter to us that was written to Jesuit seminarians who were about to be ordained. And the letter went something like this. We ask the wrong questions when we wonder if someone should be a priest. And he compared the death of Socrates with the death of Jesus. He said, you know, Socrates, who was a Greek philosopher, he went to his death with poise and with being in control and full awareness and without fear. And contrast that with Jesus, who went to his death crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Crying in pain, saying, if it's possible, take this cup from me. So he said, we ask the wrong questions. We ask questions like, is this person able to preach, to sing, to organize, to counsel, all the skills that we think a priest should have. But we really should be asking the question, is this person weak enough to be a priest? Is he so weak that he can't rely on his own resources, but has to rely on the power of God in order to help him do his ministry? And in that moment, you know, I had my head in my hands and doing my best to keep awake. And I sat up straight, and it literally felt like there was a big weight that was taken right off my shoulders. And at that moment, I knew I was going to be ordained. Now, fast forward 1.5 years, 2 years, 3 years, I met my first assignment. And one of the things that people in that first assignment liked to do was sit in circles in homes and do affirmation exercises. So you identify for yourself what do you think is a great gift that you have. Then you turn to the person next to you and say, I think this is your gift. And you go around the circle that way. And I can't tell you the number of times when I was in one of those circles that when it came to somebody identifying my gift, they said, "Your greatest gift is your humanity." And I would just laugh. I said, "Isn't it interesting? We presume humanity among everybody else. But when it comes to a priest, it's kind of like an unusual characteristic." So anyway, that was an experience that I had many, many years ago. And I didn't come here tonight intending to share it, but your sharing prompted it. But we're going to move on now. And I'm going to try to see if I can synthesize or summarize some of these things. Now, the overarching presupposition and hypothesis of this whole program is that God always seeks us. That's why we started with the psalm that we did tonight. Where can we run from your love? Where can we run from your love? And so tonight's topic is finding God where God finds us. So where does God find us? You've named some of the situations where God finds us. And you've also indicated that some of those very same situations are the very place that we find God. And so we're looking for the convergence of the seeking and the giving, if we can put it that way. So what I'm going to do is draw on some insights from Robert Cummings Neville, who I mentioned earlier. And just to really impress you, they're coming from these 3 books, which is called Philosophical Theology, Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. And they've got such catchy titles as Ultimates, Existence, and Religion. Doesn't that make you want to pick them up and read them? But you got to be a little crazy, actually, to dip into this stuff. And I'm not going to attempt to present an accurate summary of what those 3 books hold. But I'm going to, because it's very, very technical, but I'm going to hope that they can inspire us to use some of his language to make sense of the things that we're talking about. So, I mentioned before, for Neville, religious experience is always a symbolic engagement of what he calls ultimates. Okay? Ultimates. And he notes that when we refer to God as personal, that personal is itself a symbol. It's a symbol that we use to engage God. Okay, we think of God as a person so that we can pray to God as a person, so that we can be in a presence of a person. But as Neville points out, that's symbolic. Okay? That's not a literal predication, but it is symbolic. And like every symbol, it has to be interpreted, and then collectively we try to understand what's true about this symbol and maybe what's not. So the question could rightly be put, what is an ultimate? And I'll offer this possible example. I have had the opportunity in my life to be at the bedside of both my father and mother when they were dying. And I've had the opportunity at hospice over and over again, just today again, of being at the bedside of someone who is actively dying. And I always say to people with whom I'm ministering this, said, I have learned from experience that this is the last place you want to be and the last place you don't want to be at the same time. Feeling both of those things. And the ultimate, I think, is in Neville's mind, would be where those 2 things come together. You can't go completely over to one, or you can't go completely over to the other one. It's the tension between the 2 that opens up something that is beyond who we are and how we are. Okay, so that would be a rough definition of what Neville means by ultimates. And Neville says that every religion has to deal with ultimates. And they're the same, his conviction is they're the same ultimates, but every religion deals with them through a different set of symbols and structures, etc. Okay? So he's casting a wide net in terms of how God finds us and where we can find God. Okay, certainly those of us who are Catholic Christians confess to the primacy of Catholic Christian tradition and revelation, but the church also recognizes that truth is found in other religions, and even other religions that aren't Christian. So there's an implicit awareness that God finds us, and we try to find God where God finds us. So if we're going to use Neville's language and look at what are some of the issues involved in meeting God where God finds us, what might be some summary situations? One is ontological. It's a philosophical term. It has what is most real. That's one of the questions that we might wrestle with. And then there are some anthropological ultimates, human ultimates. What is most important to people when it comes to defining their identity and their existence? So summarizing some central issues, Neville says one of the ultimate conditions of human living is living under obligation, of being obligated. It's a part of the human condition, and he says the obligation can be summarized roughly this way. When faced with the choice between two things, we are obligated to choose the better of the two. When faced with the choice between two things that might be not so good, we are obligated to choose the one that is the lesser of the two evils. And obviously, the issue is going to be, what's the better of the two or what's the lesser of the two? So there's ambiguity and wrestling that goes on with living under obligation. But being under obligation is what he calls one of the ultimates. Being centered and grounded as human beings. Who are we? What is our makeup? What is our identity? What are our gifts? What are our weaknesses? And knowing that in ways that keep us really centered and grounded. And of course, different situations are going to challenge what it means to be centered and grounded. Another issue is relating appropriately to what he calls our existential location. What is our existential location? It's where we are here and now, okay, in our network of relationships with other human beings. It's where we are in relation to the natural environment. It's where we are with respect to events that are unfolding in our lives. It's where we are with respect to our history, our past, our present, and what might be our future. All of that is part of what he means by our existential location. And that is an ultimate consideration in which we might possibly discover and find God seeking us. Pursuing value identity, simply for him that means what are we meant to be? What should we be pursuing in terms of our ultimate identity? Okay? What would be the best persons that we could be? And not just in this moment, but 100 years from now, if somebody were to look back at who we are and the effect we've had on other people, what would they say was our value to those folks? What was our identity? And then another ultimate would be what he calls the ongoing act of creation. He says that he's a philosopher now, so I'm borrowing his term. He's not thinking of God as a personal being creating the world. He's saying in his system that the world is being created all the time. Every moment that we are in existence is an ontological act of creation, which is happening over and over and over again. Interestingly, this is not necessarily in conflict with Catholic theology, which holds that at every moment of our existence, God continues to be creating. He just won't take the next step, or he's reluctant to make the only way of thinking of that as a personal act of creation. Let me get my notes here. So I'm sharing these with you because it's possible that the very stories that you shared might have some connection with some of these ontological or some of these ultimates. I suspect they were. And he says, again, all of these are engaged symbolically. Okay. So I'm going to share a root metaphor with you. A root metaphor, when we think of metaphor, we think of comparisons. you know. There was a philosopher named Paul Ricoeur who talked about root metaphor being two things coming together that don't normally belong together, but when they come together, they clash in such a way to give rise to a new meaning. And one of the examples that's easy to come upon is a loud color, right? What's a loud color? Loud has to do with sound, color has to do with vision. You bring them together and we're able to say some things and experience some things that we're not able to say and experience without that metaphor. Okay, so a root metaphor is one that is so effective that it can pull together other metaphors and help to relate them to one another. So here's the root metaphor that I'm going to share. Spacewalking. And the reason that I'm sharing this metaphor has to do with someone that some of you knew while he was alive. Lenny Cervenek. How many of you knew Lenny? I'm just curious. Yeah, Lenny passed away a few years ago. Lenny used to stop in at the rectory and talk unannounced half a dozen times a year. And one day he stopped in and he was very, very distraught. He had just come from the doctors and received a diagnosis that was probably terminal. And we talked for about 45 minutes about what it meant for him, what it was going to mean for his family, how he was going to deal with it. And at the end of that conversation, he took off. And 2 or 3 days later, as he often did, he caught me on my way out of church. And he stopped me and he said, "Father, I'm spacewalking. I'm spacewalking." And I thought, what a powerful and beautiful and apt image for what his experience was at the time. And if we go back to those ultimates that I mentioned, he's wrestling with obligations to himself, to his family, to his God. He was wrestling with what makes me who I am, and what does all this mean for who I am. He's wrestling with his existential location. What impact does this have on my relationships with my family, the wider community, in the wider universe? What is my ultimate identity going to be as a result of all of this? And I have to leave open the question of what it meant for gratitude for his ongoing act of creation. But I suspect Lenny was an interesting person, but he was also a very faithful person. He had a deep faith. So I am going to give Lenny due credit for this image of spacewalking as a way to think about ultimates. So now I'm going to ask you to bear with me as I did a little research on spacewalking, okay, in preparation for tonight. So I'm going to quote from 3 articles that I looked at. First one. When astronauts venture outside of the International Space Station to go on spacewalks, the most important thing they have to do is focus. They have to do. What does that sound like? Obligation, right? Yeah. This may sound simple, but imagine trying to focus on a memorized set of tasks while stepping out of an airlock and wearing a 300-pound spacesuit, with the glow of planet Earth and sun and dark void of the universe all around you. A tether connects you to the space station, and the absence of gravity keeps you from falling. Again, we're coming up on obligation. There's a lot of things you really need to do, one of which is just keep your focus, even though it's amazing out there. It's really, truly breathtaking. The only thing between you and the rest of the universe, seeing the whole cosmos of creation, is the glass faceplate of the visor on your helmet. And it's just awe-inspiring. You remember last week we talked about sacred canopies and how the symbols in the sacred canopies help us to engage the ultimate? There's a way in which the faceplate could be considered a kind of sacred canopy through which the people doing the spacewalking see their universe. It's just awe-inspiring. So they get a sense of their existential location in the big scheme of things. Gratitude for the ongoing creation. Literally, they're in the middle of the big banging. What's happening now is still 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 part of what got us all started in the first place. Then here's a second story. It's the saddest moment of my life. Okay. That's a quote from Ed White, who was America's first spacewalker. He described the moment when he was ordered to climb back inside the Gemini spacecraft after spending more than half an hour floating freely in space. Those who have experienced a spacewalk would agree. Spacewalking is an amazing experience, and there's nothing else remotely like it. The view is breathtaking. Darkness and light fly by. There is a unique sense of freedom, which I think is connected to grounded wholeness or being centered. In order to be truly free, we have to have a centeredness. Spacewalkers are even treated to something truly unusual, the smell of space. And this says something about existential location. It's not just something we see, and not just something we know, it's something that we perceive through all of our senses. While walking in space may sound like a lot of fun, for the astronaut it's all work. Obligation, right? So you can see how some of those ultimates are exemplified in spacewalking. Here's the third one, and this is the one, it's a little longer, but I think it really captures. A man named Chris Hadfield, who was an astronaut, was explicitly asked, what does it feel like? What's the experience of spacewalking? And he said this, but suddenly you do this one step, and suddenly you are in a place that you hadn't conceived how beautiful this could be, how stupefying this could be. And by stupefying, I mean it stops your thought. My verbal descriptions are wow. My verbal descriptions were so pathetic, but the experience is just overwhelming. Some of you, when you were describing your encounters with God, would have used the word overwhelming. It's like coming around a corner and seeing the most magnificent sunset of your life. From one horizon to the other, where it looks like the whole sky is on fire, and there are all those colors, and the sun's rays look like some great painting up over your head. You just want to open your eyes wide and try to look around at the image, and just try to soak it up. It's like that all the time. God is always seeking us. Do we have our eyes open all the time? Or maybe the most beautiful music just filling your soul, or seeing an absolutely gorgeous person where you can't but just stare. It's like that all the time. And then his final reflection. But then you notice that even though it is a huge and capable, he's talking about the space station now, it is just a speck between everything which is on your left and all the colors and textures of our planet that are just pouring next to you on the right. And you are this little part of a microcosm in between those two things, both physically and historically. So what do we have here? Which ultimates are at play? Grounded centeredness. Who am I? Existential location. Space station here, a little speck, everything big around me. Value identity. What am I going to be? Where am I going? And I think certainly his talk about awe-inspiring is an indication of his gratitude for, again, being caught up in the very act of the big banging continuing around him. And you're very much aware of that the whole time. I'm sort of gushing, but that is what a spacewalk feels like. It is infinitely worth all the thousands of steps it takes to get there. It's a great, great thing. I recommend it highly. Okay. But I think this really is a very good image of what encounters with the ultimate are like. And I do recommend it highly. So that's one way of trying to bring together the varied reflections that you have and what underlines your convictions about this experience of God being present and active. There's another one that Neville calls predicaments. And predicaments happen when one of the ultimates summons you to do or be something, and for one reason or another, you fail to do so, or are ignorant of how to do so, or just don't feel capable of doing so. Then you find yourself in that predicament. It's a little bit, again, like being at that bedside and wanting to be there and not wanting to be there at the same time. So some of the predicaments with obligation, if we don't meet our obligations, we experience guilt. Some of those obligations involve moral obligations, social, personal, natural obligations. The obligation to be well-grounded, centeredness, we fail at that when we fall into disintegration, where we don't appropriate the aspects of ourselves that God has created us to be, when we're not sufficiently respectful for our own gifts and talents and limitations, when rather than negotiating change in ways that are responsible, we just choose to suffer, or maybe we have an unrealistic sense of who we are. When we talk about existential location, the idea is the ultimate is to engage the reality in which we find ourselves, but sometimes we fail by estrangement. We're not sufficiently aware. We don't appreciate the things in our life experience. We're afraid to engage and encounter another. And sometimes we just think it's too much and we despair of attempting the engagement. And then the identity achievement, if we don't pursue these things well and with appropriate deliberation, rather than achieving something, we can destroy ourselves. So these involve failures perhaps to name and achieve personal goals or public contributions. Maybe we don't face suffering well, or we simply don't relate to ultimacy well. So what he wants to say, though, is that when we find ourselves in these predicaments, these themselves are situations that are opportunities to encounter the ultimate. The ultimate pokes its head through these predicaments as we're between our failure and now what we have to do as a result of our failure or our limitations. Okay. Remember I said last week that one author talked about the sacred canopy and said that sometimes the most powerful images, sometimes the sacred canopy is the most powerful when it gets torn. And I think this would be another way of saying that. Then there's some other predicaments. How do you like that one? Two rhinoceroses on a tightrope. This is from a man named John Kekes, and I'll just go through these real fast because they bear some similarity to what Neville's predicaments are. Deep conflicts, difficult choices, the force of fate, fear of meaninglessness, the contingencies of life, the divided self, the complexities of life, unavoidable hypocrisy, the miasma of boredom, the prevalence of evil. Those are all kinds of predicaments in which we find ourselves torn in between, and there's no easy answers, but we're always summoned to wrestle with something that draws us out and beyond ourselves. On the danger of innocence. I think that means, it's been a while since I read this, but I think it means the kind of innocence that is naive to not be able to recognize some of the evils and challenges in the world. Now there are also ultimates that are ecstasies. Okay? It's not just a matter of predicaments, but sometimes things are just so awesome that they are an opportunity for an encounter with the ultimate, with the divine. I mean, think of those descriptions of the astronauts looking around. There's no words for it. It's unbelievably beautiful. I mean, those were ecstatic experiences. There's mystical experiences that spiritual saints describe when they're at prayer. There's the experience of undeserved love, which can just work wonders in someone's psyche and spirituality. Freedom. To be truly free is an ecstatic experience. goodness and beauty, and you can name others. So as far as trying to gather all of your stories together and what convinced you that God was present here, I'm going to suggest that perhaps this language of ultimates, both those categories that I mentioned, the predicaments that arise when those ultimates cannot be appropriately engaged, and the ultimates of ecstasies, all those can be occasions where we find God, where God is finding us. See how we're doing here? All right, we have time for a small group discussion. And this may be difficult, because I went through this pretty quickly. But which of Neville's ultimate issues, or predicaments related to them, or ecstasies, can you identify in your own experience? And in what ways, if at all, can they be fruitful occasions of finding God where God finds us? Okay? So which ultimates can you identify in your own experience, and what can be helpful, fruitful occasions of finding God where God finds us? Now I'm going to back up to where I had the, oops, excuse me. Okay, I'm just going to put these central issues on the screen to help you remember what they are. So which of these ultimates, perhaps, or ecstasies, could you mention as at play in your experience, and what might it help you be attentive to going forward? How many of you experienced obligation, or being centered, or existential vocation, or embracing the ongoing act of creating? Feel free to stammer at your tables about this. Or, how many of your experiences had characteristics of spacewalking? Try it that way. The next thing that I'm going to ask you to do is provide a written evaluation, but I want to do kind of a summary of what we've done the last few weeks. Okay? Week 1, we looked at who we are as symbolizing animals. And I brought in some information from Terence Deacon and some neuroscientists, but said that I was really going to be indebted to Robert Cummings Neville for his approach to symbolizing. So the first week we were just trying to figure out what does it mean to be a symbolizing animal. Okay? How do we refer to things? How do we judge the truth of our symbols? How do we do that together? I introduced the notion of Neville's notion of fallibilism. You know, we have to, when we're looking for the truth of symbols, we have to recognize that we might not be entirely accurate in the claims we're making with regard to what the symbols mean, but over a period of time, as we search for the truth together, hopefully we close in more accurately on that. The second session, we looked at what I called official religious symbols. And what I want to say about this is that the official religious symbols that we talked about that night address these central issues. Okay? They don't all address them in the same way, and some of those official religious symbols, depending on the circumstances, might address all of them at the same time. So our Catholic Christian symbols are ways of addressing these ultimates in our lives. Okay? Last week, we explored the reality that it seems like increasingly in our day and age, there is a disaffiliation with organized religion, Christianity in particular, and that what might speak to those of us who have been raised with these symbols doesn't seem to speak to a lot of people in our wider society. And we looked at what some of the causes of that might be, and particularly we took a good hard look at cultural influences. Okay? And that really brings us to tonight. If it works for some and not for others, then what do we do to try to help people recognize and get connected to God when the official symbols aren't working? Okay? We can say, well, we can do our best to try to educate people a little bit better as to what these symbols are all about. But we mentioned that the cultural influences that are different can be so overwhelming. So we want to recognize that God finds us even when we might not be finding God. And so we want to be open to the possibility that even when the official religious symbols don't seem to be working, God might be raising us into situations where other symbols speak to us and help us to encounter God. And maybe that becomes the vehicle by which people then reconnect with the official religious symbols. Or maybe not. I think we have to open that possibility. So that's the logic of this 4-week Lenten series. Okay? So now I'm going to ask you, and again, you do not have to sign your name to this. Okay? I'm going to ask you to take a few minutes to do an evaluation of what we've done and to leave it at your table when you're done. So as you're completing this, I'm just going to make a few closing comments. I want to thank you all for your participation in this series. I was very edified by the seriousness with which you engaged the conversation. It made it all feel worthwhile from my point of view. Maybe your evaluations will tell me something different, but you kept coming back, and that was a good sign. And I think there was an energy in the room that was very positive. I was glad not only for the content, but for the opportunity for people to meet new people and to get to know each other a little bit better and a little bit differently. So that was all very good, I think. I want to thank, she's not here tonight, although she was here earlier to set up Brianna on our staff who took care of the refreshments every week. She volunteered to do that as soon as we decided to do this series, and I'm very grateful for that. I hope you have a good rest of Lent, Holy Week, and good Easter. Yes?
I just wanted to say thanks to Nicole, too, for putting those YouTube thingies up every week, because I can't even tell you how helpful that was to be able to review it, especially the first session. I had to watch that one about 100 times. Yeah. But it was really very helpful, so I know that took a lot of work. I really appreciated it.
And thanks for mentioning that, Nicole. I apologize for not acknowledging you. And she's not done yet. I haven't sent her tonight's presentation yet, so that'll take a couple of days to get up if you want to go back and look at that. Okay, so please stand. God, beyond all words, all creation tells your story. You have shaken with our laughter. You have trembled with our tears. All around us we have known you. All creation lives to hold you. In our living and our dying, we are bringing you to birth. God, beyond all time, you are laboring within us. We are moving, we are changing in your spirit ever new. All around us we have known you. All creation lives to hold you. In our living and our dying, we are bringing you to birth. Amen? Amen. Go safely.
Thank you.